Hey guys, welcome to another video. In today's video, I'll be talking about all the books that I read in the month of September. In the month of September, I didn't do too bad in terms of reading. I did end up reading 3 books, so I guess that's better than 1, you know? Ah man, the standards for me have dropped considerably. So without further ado, we'll get straight into this wrap-up. The first book that I finished in the month of September was Jim Butcher's Stormfront. This is the first book from the Dresden Files. The Dresden Files, if you don't know, probably do know, it is a highly popular and well-known paranormal series. I would say it has a very interesting kind of concept. You're following our main character who's a wizard, but he's also a private investigator. I'm not too sure if it's set in the 80s or 90s, but technically it's contemporary time. At least the first book is set in Chicago, and it kind of just follows Harry Dresden as he investigates into this kind of murder case, and he kind of collaborates with the local kind of police department as well as using his wizard skills. Overall, I would say that this was relatively entertaining for me, but at the same time it wasn't like spectacular in any way. I'm assuming the series just gets better as you read through it, because this series has like over 10 books, and I think it's still an ongoing series if I'm not mistaken, and so I'm sure the writing gets better. There's a lot of things about the character that just doesn't age well in terms of like the sexism, but overall, like I said, I did enjoy this book, and I also think like the mystery and crime aspects to the story were very interesting. It kind of kept me engaged throughout the whole story. The murder cases are quite gnarly, so I guess it is safe to assume that it's gonna have some darker elements, even though the main character is quite sarcastic, and I thought that he would be a little bit more charismatic than I found him to be when I actually read the book, because I've heard that this book series is kind of like light-hearted. I mean, it's dealing with darker issues, but it still contains like humor, and because of our main character's kind of sarcastic attitude, I suppose, it does kind of tread on a fine line between being kind of a darker crime mystery whilst also being kind of humorous. It was kind of like a weird mix of emotions that I had towards it. Like, did I really enjoy it? I heard such good things about it that I was just ever so slightly disappointed, at least with the first book. I will probably continue on with the series and just see how it goes. I might give it another 3 or 4 books before I solidly decide to continue on with the series or just like, you know, let it go. But so far, I think the idea of it is really interesting and intriguing. There's kind of certain elements that weren't really resolved at the end of the book, but the main kind of conflict was resolved. So I was like, okay, I'm on board. I know this is gonna unravel into something bigger. There's also like these rules that he needs to follow because, you know, he's a wizard, but he's kind of a part of this bigger system when it comes to like the wizards of this world. So there are kind of laws against him doing certain stuff, and so it really kind of ties him down when he's trying to do like the PI work, because he wants to use certain elements of his magic, but it's kind of forbidden magic. So it's like, it kind of gets a little bit frustrating, especially when he's like in serious danger in this story. But anyway, like I said, I did enjoy this book. I thought it was a fun read. It was relatively lighthearted. The crime genre isn't particularly a genre that I usually read from, so it was nice to kind of read into that sort of story whilst also having a little bit of a fantastical twist to it. I ended up giving Stormfront 3 stars out of 5 on Goodreads, and I would say that I enjoyed it for the most part, but certain stuff I was like, I don't know about that. Just kind of regarding his viewpoints. But what I really did appreciate about Harry, our main protagonist that we're following, is that he's not the typical like badass wizard. He's a little bit cowardly, and he just doesn't really know what he's doing sometimes, and a lot of the times when he gets out of like dangerous situations, it's more so out of luck rather than his wit and his skills as a wizard. There's certain times when he really does hone in his skills as a wizard, but most of the time it's just like dumb luck that he gets away from the dangers. So that was very interesting, because I thought going into this story that Harry Dresden was this kind of confident wizard, and he had the swag and like the coolness of being like a private investigator as well as being a wizard. But no, he's like kind of a loser. No, I won't say he's a loser, but like he's really like not the personality that I initially thought he was going into the book. That's kind of what gave this book a little bit more of a positive reaction for me, because it kind of gave the main character quite a big flaw in the narrative. So I did very much appreciate the fact that he wasn't like this cool kind of protagonist. The next book I ended up reading is Forest of Souls. This is by Laurie M. Lee, and this is kind of like a dark YA fantasy, and I very much appreciated this. This kind of reminded me of like the Poppy Wars. It's not the same, but the fact that, you know, they refer to the magic users as shamans, it just kind of like triggered that for me, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like the Poppy War, even though it's not really. This is a completely different story from the Poppy War. I very much enjoyed Forest of Souls. I didn't expect to like it as much as I did, and also going into it, I didn't know really what to expect exactly. I knew going into it, it was a sort of darker YA fantasy. I mean, from the visual aesthetics alone, this looks dark, but more than anything, I think I was more impressed by the main character. I actually really liked the main character. So this is the first book in the Shamanborn series. I think it's gonna be a trilogy. I'm not entirely sure. From what I've read, I'm very intrigued to continue on. Aside from liking the main character, the core of the story is about a friendship. I kind of wish that it was even more strongly portrayed. I think in the later half of the book, the friendship aspect is there, but it's not like at the forefront of the book. But I did appreciate that this story kind of focused more on a friendship rather than a romantic relationship, even though I get the inkling that there's gonna be potential romantic relationships forming in the future. But yeah, I really like this book, and I'm kind of surprised because I kind of went into this book thinking that it was just gonna be kind of an average read. I don't know why I had somewhat of a negative attitude going into this, but good thing I did, because this really surprised me in the best way possible. Basically follows this girl named Saoirse. I'm assuming that's how you say her name. She's training to be the Queen's Shadow, which is a messenger, a spy slash assassin sort of person that's very close to the Queen, and so she's training under the current Shadow. It seems like she's the potential successor that's going to become the new Shadow, but one thing leads to another. She is revealed to have magical powers, and so she quickly loses her position in a way. In this world, the kingdoms are kind of divided, and between the kingdoms there's this thing called the Deadwood that kind of stops and prevents like kingdoms from invading each other. And Saoirse lives in one of the kingdoms where the Queen has kind of abolished all shamanism, so anyone with like magical abilities, she's imprisoned them. And so when she's revealed to have powers, obviously it's not gonna go well for her, especially in the kingdom she's living in. So she's on the run with her friend, and then she's kind of taken in by the Spider King, who is the guy that kind of is in control of the Deadwood, and so he's the one that keeps the dark magical properties of the Deadwood at bay, and so he's kind of controlling that, but his powers seem to be slipping, and so he kind of recruits Saoirse because she not only has like the shamanism power, but her powers are revealed to be somewhat unique because she has the power of necromancy, and so that kind of element is very important in some way for the Deadwood, and so he kind of recruits her and tries to train her in order to help him control the Deadwood. And that's kind of like the basic premise of the story, but it kind of unravels into something bigger. There's a lot of political maneuverings. However, like our main character isn't very involved in the politics, so she's kind of witnessing the political machinations as they kind of unfold in front of her. And so I kind of wish that she was a little bit more involved, especially because she was training to be the Shadow. We do know that Saoirse is kind of a badass. She's really good at fighting and should be like the perfect assassin and whatnot. I'm so glad that I actually really enjoyed this book more than I had anticipated. I ended up giving this book a 4 stars out of 5 on Goodreads, and I think that it's a very strong first book into a series, and there's a lot of intriguing elements. Our main protagonist was pretty badass. I love the concept, I love the kind of atmosphere of the world, so I can't wait to eventually pick up the second book in the series. But yes, I enjoyed this book immensely and I would highly recommend. Very much appreciated this. So the last book that I ended up finishing in the month of September is The Female of the Species. This is by Mindy McGinnis, and I had no intention of reading this book, but I recently discovered a new booktuber that I am personally very obsessed obsessed with her videos because she comes off very sweet, and just the passionate way she talks about books just really makes me want to pick up the books that she recommends. I'm talking about Sabine from Sabine's Book Nook. She's got no idea who I am, but I ended up watching a video of hers where she raves about this book, and so I ended up picking up this because of her recommendation. And let me just say, I kind of didn't know what to expect going into this book, but safe to say, I enjoyed this book immensely. Like, the stuff that happens in it, although it's kind of a more contemporary setting, it's kind of following like teenagers while they kind of navigate their school lives, or like, you know, teenage lives. It follows 3 different characters. So we have Alex Croft, who's one of the characters that we follow, pretty much the main character. Then we have Jack, who's kind of like a jock, one of the popular guys in her school. And then we follow PK, who is the pastor's kid. She's kind of in the same crowd as Jack. She's not really a part of like the popular kids, but she kind of hangs around them. So I don't know if she's part of the crew. It's hard to say. I feel like in this book, like the kind of stereotypes or the conventions of like high schoolers aren't really like defined. It's not very distinct. So like a lot of the kids kind of hang out with each other, even though they're considered like the popular kids or like the nerdy kids. Well, I don't think there was any nerdy kids, but like Alex Croft is kind of like an oddball outsider, but she ends up hanging out with these people as well. This is kind of like a contemporary book, but also like a mystery thriller. This is in the synopsis, but what you know is that Alex Croft has actually murdered someone. It was kind of like a revenge act because her sister was brutalized and murdered. So at the beginning of the book, she's already done the deed. She also seems like she's a bit of a sociopath. She's a bit odd. Like, no one really knows her specifically, but they know of her because of her sister being found dead in the woods. They're kind of like tiptoe around her a bit, but she's not really friends with anyone specifically until she starts working at this animal shelter with PK. And so she kind of gets intrigued by Alex Croft because they're hanging out with each other at this animal shelter that they're volunteering for. There is this kind of friendship that forms, which is beautiful. I loved it, but I always feel like this unnerving tension that Alex is just not right in the head, and so I was, you know, nervous the whole way through. Also, the perspective of Jack, he somehow gets very intrigued by Alex, and he's kind of dealing with this very deeply seated guilt that he feels of some incident that happened in the past, and so he's trying to deal with that, but also, you know, having this newfound intrigue with Alex. So that's kind of like the basic kind of premise that the story is set for. Things just go to places that you just don't expect in terms of like these kids from this little small town where everyone knows everyone. It's almost very suffocating in a way where it's a small town, like I said, and like parents of other parents knows each other very well because they've also grown up in this town, and something about like that suffocating nature just makes us feel like these characters are just gonna repeat what their parents have done, and just like nothing's gonna change. The most intriguing character is Alex because, like I said, she's a murderer. She has some sort of darkness that's kind of implied as like a hereditary kind of trait. This book is by no means sweet and wholesome. It's actually quite dark, and it does talk about very confronting topics about like sexual assault and abuse, and so trigger warnings for that, but otherwise it is a very compelling sort of mystery. It's never unraveled to be this bigger plot, but within like the lives of these teenagers, it ends up going into places that you don't expect. It's quite tragic in a way, and I was just really I broke a little towards the end. I really enjoyed this book. Oh my gosh. I didn't really know what to expect because I just knew going into the plot that it's about this girl who's murdered someone. I had very minimal knowledge before going into the book, but I will say that I was thoroughly thrilled. I enjoyed this book so much. Also, when I finished this book, on the back it has like other books that were written by Mindy McGinnis, and I actually do own A Madness So Discreet. I got that book so long ago in like an owl crate, never got around to it, feeling a little bit guilty about not picking that book up, but now that I've read this book, I'm like, okay, I need to read more books by Mindy McGinnis because I am intrigued. Yeah, I highly enjoyed this book, and I would most definitely recommend it, especially if you want to read something slightly coming of age but also like dealing with heavier topics about like rape culture, but also like you know, teenage life and angst. Oh my gosh, it was so tense. My feels were like all over the place for this book. I also ended up giving The Female of the Species a 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. It's a little bit bittersweet, but I enjoyed this book immensely. I don't know what else to say. Also, very much appreciate this floppy book. Anyway, I honestly didn't expect to like this book as much as I did. So that is it, guys. These are the 3 books that I finished in the month of September. I would say that I had a relatively good reading month because I enjoyed all 3 of those books. I think Stormfront was like my least favorite, but I still enjoyed that book and I did really like the concept of that story. And so I am intrigued to continue on with both the Dresden Files and the Shamanborn series. Have you guys also read any of these books? Please let me know in the comments down below whether you enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it, what your thoughts and feels are for these books. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I will see you in my next one. Bye!